Jennifer, the Inquiring Quilter, and welcome to another episode of Intelligent Quilting, where you learn the tricks and the traps in various quilting methods so you can choose the one that works best for you. Today's topic is flying geese. So let me introduce you to this very popular unit for quilt blocks. This is a flying geese unit. As you can see, there's a triangle that points up. That is called the goose. And then there's two little half square triangles on the side. Those are the sky. So when you make a flying geese unit, you will be using two different fabrics. The goose fabric, which here is kind of a red or coral, and then you'll be using sky fabric, which in this case is dotted. Now that you know what a flying goose is, or a flying geese unit, let's take a look at how they're used in quilts. Back here, you can see that they're just flying geese arranged in a column, and it forms a very strong point. They're probably called flying geese because if you've ever looked at geese in a sky, they fly in a triangle like that. It's a aerodynamic method that enables them to kind of save energy as they're flying, because one of them is breaking the wind for the ones behind, and then they rotate through. Bet you didn't know that this was going to be, have you tuned into the Nature Channel? But anyway, that's why it's called a flying geese, because the unit looks like geese in flight, and it's very dramatic. As you can see, very strong kind of unit. Now that you know what a flying geese is, let's talk about several of the ways in which you can make flying geese. The first method, or most common method, is called stitch and flip, or connecting corners, or flipped corners. And that's because of the way it's made. Let me show you. You will take a rectangle of fabric, like that, and then you will take squares. You'll mark a diagonal on the square, put them on the corner of the rectangle, so on the diagonal that you've marked, and then you will press or flip that corner back towards the corner of the rectangle. You do this again on the other side, and that's how you get your flying geese unit. Now, the pros of this kind of method is that, well, it's pretty simple. Also, you're sewing on a line, so you're going to be pretty accurate. However, as a con to this method, you may or may not, depending on how well you sew on that line and how well you press, this flipped back corner may not meet the corner of the rectangle. Now, as you can see on mine, it has. As a matter of fact, it's over met the corner, so as I trim this up, it will be perfect. But sometimes what happens is your corner is a little bit, let me see if I can kind of, like that, not quite to the corner. No matter how much you press, it's just not to the corner. So that's a negative for this method. Another positive is that with this method, because you're sewing the individual squares on, you can choose two different colors. So let me show you how that might be an advantage. Take a look at this quilt here. Notice that it has 4 flying geese. This is a traditional one with the 2 colors are the same. Here, the 2 colors are the same. But here, there's a different fabric on one corner as opposed to the other. And the way to get that is to use this stitch and flip method. So that's the first method for making flying geese. Probably the most popular method, however, is something called fast flying geese, no waste flying geese, or 4 at a time flying geese. It is truly a no waste method, so that's one of its benefits. And the way it works is you take a rather large square, and then you cut 4 smaller squares. You're going to be drawing a line diagonally through the center of those 2 squares. And you can also draw sewing lines if you want to, because you're going to be sewing 1/4 of an inch from that big diagonal line. You're going to do that once, and then after you get this basic unit complete, you'll cut it apart and you'll repeat the process, and that's how you end up with 4 flying geese. The benefits, obviously, is that it's fast. You use a slightly larger starting square of fabric, but you end up with 4 matching flying geese. Why is that nice? Well, take a look at this quilt back here. 4 flying geese that are exactly the same. That's what you need for that particular block. So it's nice to be able to do that. The negative is, you've probably figured out, you're going to be drawing lines on all those squares that you have to put, all the sky squares that you have to put on. And drawing lines will waste a little bit of time. There are tricks for this drawing line business that I will show you when I get to the sewing section for each of these methods, but the fact that you do have to draw a line, it does waste a little bit of time. Also, for the fast flying geese method, the size of these squares may be a little hard to cut. We'll get to the math later when I get to the actual sewing section, but let's say I was going to make 2 by 4 inch finished flying geese. In that case, I'm going to start with a big square that's 5 1/4 inches and 2 smaller squares that are 2 7/8. So 7/8 isn't exactly the easiest number to cut with a ruler. You can, but we tend to want to do whole numbers like 3 inches or maybe 3 1/4, things that are a little easier to see on our rulers. There's ways around that as well. You can start with bigger squares and then trim your geese down. That's fine, but that does add to the time. Or you can use, and I'll show you, there's a special tape that you can put on your ruler that will mark where you're supposed to be measuring so that you won't mess it up and you won't accidentally start using 3 inches when you meant 2 7/8. So that's the pros and the cons of that particular method. The next method I'd like to talk to you about is by far my favorite, and that's because it's the AccuQuilt method. And with the AccuQuilt method, you use 2 different dies, like these. One of these dies, this one, is die number 5, and it cuts half square triangles, 2 at a time. And then over here is the die number 4, which cuts 1/4 square triangles. So let me show you how that works. This is a 1/4 square triangle. And then here is a half square triangle. You will put them together like this. Stitch, press, and that'll be half of your flying geese unit. And then by the time you're done, you'll end up with this. Now, why do I like it? Well, first of all, what's not to like about having a machine cut your fabric? So it's fast that way. Also, as a negative, you will be dealing with bias. There is bias here on the Goose triangle, and there is bias here on the half square triangle or sky triangle. However, I don't really find that to be all that difficult. If you take your 2 pieces, don't handle them too much, you place them together. You'll notice there's little notches that help you align the triangles exactly right. You sew, you press, you will end up with a flying geese unit that is exactly the size you need it to be. So that's another time saver. With the AccuQuilt method, you're not going to be trimming down. Now, if you don't have an AccuQuilt cutter, you can still duplicate this particular method with specialty rulers. Like, for example, there is the easy angle and companion angle pair of rulers, and you do need both of them because one of them will cut your 1/4 square triangles correctly from a strip, and the other one will cut your half square triangle units from a strip. But you'll basically end up with things like this, and you'll be able to sew them just like you would with the AccuQuilt method, and therefore save yourself some time. Another method that you can use for making triangles is foundation paper. This happens to be triangles on a roll. As you can see, they're on a roll. And they're marked. You follow the manufacturer's directions. You're going to be using pieces similar to this and this. Placing them where indicated and sewing where indicated so. One of the benefits is that there are lines already marked for you, and you will end up with perfectly precise flying geese when you use triangle paper, triangles on a roll, or any other kind of triangle paper that's designed for flying geese. The negative is, and it should be maybe obvious, you have to remove the paper. I'm not a big fan of that, but there are tricks that I can teach you to help you remove the paper. And so that's another method that you can use to make flying geese. The final method that you can use for making flying geese is called the one seam method. And it is pretty flippin' cool because, as you might have guessed, if you're only sewing one single seam, wow, that must be fast. The way it works is you start off with rectangles and 2 squares, just like the stitch and flip method. Then you're going to be folding your goose rectangle and then laying the 2 sky squares on top of it and sewing a single seam, and then the magic happens. When you press it, you're folding that rectangle out and it forms the goose. So the negative with this method is that, well, frankly, the pressing business is not fast, but once you get used to it, it is pretty fast. The biggest negative to me is that it's 3-dimensional. So because this is folded in here, you're going to end up, let me see if I can hold this correctly, you're going to end up with a pocket here. So the way you close that pocket is you stitch down the edge of the goose for each and every flying geese unit that you make, in order to close that and not have it flapping open. That may not be something that a long armer would want to do, because their long arm needle the foot might easily jump into that pocket and then, damage your quilt. So before you choose this method, I would check, if you're going to not quilt it yourself, check with your long armer first and make sure that they're willing to quilt it for you. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure that the speed is going to make up for the trouble you're going to have in having to quilt it yourself. I quilt my own quilts, so that's not really a big deal for me, but it might be for some of you, so I thought it's worth mentioning. So those are the 5 methods for making flying geese. And now that you know the pluses and the minuses of each one, you can choose the one that works best for you and for your current project. In the next video, I'll be talking about the tools that I recommend for making flying geese. Until then, be sure to follow. That way you'll be notified when I make more videos and upload them to YouTube. And if you like the video, like the video. That helps too. Thank you very much, and see you later.